Homology in vertebrate limbs. This is the next one in the series of icons of evolution. This is commonly used in textbooks as an empirical observation, which it is, of a true fact that can be observed in nature, but then used and extrapolated on as evidence for common descent. Now here is the picture, and you can see here kind of what the facts are, and then the argument made from the facts, which I'll argue is kind of a non sequitur. It doesn't necessarily follow the argument that's being made. So we see here what is called homology. Homology or homologous means something's the same or similar structure in this case. So when they talk about homologous or homology in vertebrate limbs, we're talking about animals that have bones, animals that have spines, animals that have these structures in them that look and are similar in their function in many ways, and also they are similar in the way that they look. Not all of them are similar in function. For example, the bird's arm to fly is not the same thing as what the human arm does. So they're similar in some functions, not all. But as you can see, you've got the turtle claw, the human arm, horse's leg, the bird's wing, a bat's wing, a seal's flipper, and they seem to have these similar structures. It has a humerus, a radial and ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, which is what the human arm has as well. And so this is an empirical fact. It can be observed, it can be seen in nature that these things are this way. That being said, we have to make a few observations. Remember, these are names and classifications that people making observations and taking down data are observing and recording. So for example, we call our arm bones radius and the ulna, right? The two arm bones, which other structures have as well in other animals. But remember, and this, I'm being a little bit facetious here, but it does serve to prove a point. The other animals, the animals did not name the bones in their arms, the radius and the ulna. And I mention that because homology is used as evidence in textbooks and by scientists, I think incorrectly, as evidence for descent, common descent from a common ancestor. The argument goes, as you may be able to tell, is that because we have these similar structures in our human arm, the horse, the bird, the bat, that we have these homologous structures, we have structures that are similar, that therefore we must have in our past all shared some sort of common ancestor, whether distantly or whether more recently. And that may not be obvious through just the structure, but it may be somewhere in DNA, or information or something of that nature. But it comes from a common place, and therefore it looks common. Well, that would have to be proven. That would have to be observed and tested and demonstrated in some empirical way. And many argue that it has been, and I disagree, because just the fact that these structures are classified the same way and may even have some similar functions. Again, the human arm is not used like the bat wing to fly. So it is similar in that it has some homologous structures. They're different. They show up in ways in the human and in the bat, and the DNA codes are different as well for those things. So it doesn't necessarily follow that because things look alike or they have a similar structure, that they had a similar point of origin as far as common ancestry that could presumably be proven in some way, but that's not what it necessarily points to. Now, let me talk through why that's the case. So homology, as I mentioned, in vertebrate limbs, similar looking or functioning structures in vertebrate limbs, meaning animals with backbones. And so these structures look the same, they're named the same things, they're classified the same way, they're similar looking structures, but they don't always function the same way. That's important to keep in mind. Darwin regarded this as evidence, as many do, for common ancestry, that all of these similarities point to the fact that there was a distant common ancestor for all of them, and that through changes over time, through adaptations, through the mechanism of natural selection, they evolved this way for different purposes. Darwin says, if we suppose that an early progenitor, the archetype, as it may be called, of all mammals, birds, and reptiles, had limbs constructed on the existing pattern, the similar framework of bones in the hand of a man, the wing of a bat, the fin of a porpoise, the leg of a horse, at once explained themselves on the theory of descent with slow and slight modifications. So Darwin's argument from this is, if we throw out there the theory that there was at some point in the long distant past some sort of animal with this type of structure, then that explains why the human, the bat, the porpoise, the horse have these structures today, because they evolved in different ways and diverged and got further and further away from each other as time went on, but had a common point from which they originated and evolved. Now, exactly what that common point is, there's not like a fossil demonstrating that, even put out there as evidence of here's that one point from which the horse, the man, the bat, the porpoise all originated from. And even if you did find something like that, that is seen to be the ancient progenitor or the ancient archetype of all of these things, it doesn't necessarily follow. It'd be hard to prove the link in a direct way. I'm not saying it couldn't be done. I'm just saying it would be difficult to say that just because something was found in the fossil record, that it is the ancient progenitor of something alive today. But he is pointed to in Origin of Species the similar framework of bones as evidence for his theory. He said that these similar structures proclaim so plainly that the innumerable species, genera, and families with which this world is peopled are all descended, each within its own class or group, from common parents. So he says the evidence of this is plain because these structures are similar. Therefore, we can assume it should be plain and obvious to us that we came from common parents, that we came from a common source, and therefore we share these structures, these similar structures with animals that have these homologous vertebrate limbs. The theory or the assumption is that there's a link between homology, or these similar structures, and common descent. The problem with that, logically, number one, is that it's a non sequitur. It doesn't necessarily follow that because some two things are similar in their structure that they had a common point of origin, at least as far as they came from a distant ancestor that was the same. It makes sense on kind of a surface level. But as you think of it, it doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it doesn't necessarily follow. But this was central to Darwin's theory. So he pointed to this homology in vertebrate limbs, but here's the problem, and this is why philosophy needs to be done as well within science, and logic needs to be studied, and philosophy needs to be studied alongside science, because science has a philosophy, whether people acknowledge it or not. And when I say science, I mean people trying to engage in science. They're following a philosophy that has presuppositions, that has assumptions. But here's where kind of the problem comes from. No one, I'm not going to say no one, but people shouldn't debate that these structures are similar or look similar. They have similar building blocks. They have similar, sometimes, functions, right? But similarity is just an observation. It's an empirical observation about the world and about nature, that these structures are similar. You can kind of classify them by the same names, though they exist in some very different animals. That being said, to watch for this, because homology gets redefined. There's a couple logical fallacies here. Number one is the logical fallacy of the non sequitur, which is it doesn't follow. That's that one thing does not necessarily connect and link to the next thing. And that is one of the issues here of because the human hand and the rest of these structures are similar, therefore they have a common ancestor. Well, that key therefore doesn't necessarily follow these two things. It could, and just saying it doesn't necessarily follow. The other thing is the fallacy of reification. The fallacy of reification is the switching of a name or a definition, and that's what happened here. Definitionally, homology was just similar structures, right? Which we can see here in this picture. That's true. But the definition was changed. The previous definition was just an observation of similar structures, but there was a redefinition. The definition of homology was changed from similar structures because of assumed common ancestry. And so this is going to lead to another logical fallacy, another philosophical problem. Because it's one thing to observe that these structures are similar in their look and how they're put together, but it's another thing to say that these are put together by definition because of a common ancestor, and then use that as evidence for evolution. Here's why. Because this is the next fallacy of this. It becomes circular reasoning. This is the logical error of circular reasoning or question begging. Now, when I say circular reasoning, I mean something that is viciously circular, something that assumes what it seeks to prove. Or it's also known as the logical fallacy of question begging. People say that all the time mistakenly. They say, well, this begs the question or that begs the question. What question begging actually means is that you assume something in your statement, and then you try to use that statement to try to prove it. It's more commonly known as circular reasoning. Now, circular reasoning or circular arguments, there is a point of authority which we come back to in all argumentation. And so, for example, using the laws of logic, well, how would you prove the validity of the laws of logic? Well, one, you have to believe them, you have to assume that they're valid, and then to prove them, you have to follow a methodology that is consistent with the laws of logic. So it follows back and circles back around to the laws of logic. You can't escape them in that sense. So that's a circular argument in a sense that's valid, but it's not question begging. It's not viciously circular reasoning like the homology is. Let me give you an example and go back one slide. Assume that we are trying to prove that all of these animals with similar structures and humans have a common ancestor. We want to give evidence for that. And so we observe truthfully and accurately that there are similar structures. There are homologous structures among vertebrates. Animals with spines, animals with bones. And so we observe homologous structures. But then we want to think, why are those structures similar? Why are they homologous? And so we redefine homology to mean they are similar by definition because they had a previous common ancestor. Now we've got a logical problem, because what we started out to prove was that they had a common ancestor. What did we look at evidence? There's a similarity. Well, why is it similar? Because they had a common ancestor. How do we know they had a common ancestor? Because the structures in their descendants are similar. Well, why are they similar? Because they had a common ancestor, and it goes on and on. So this is a circular reasoning. As you can see over here on this visual, this chart, structural similarity is noticed. That is called homology. That just means that there's an observation of a similar structure. But then the definition of homology is changed to say that the structural similarity comes from common ancestry. Well, how do we know it comes from common ancestry? Well, because the structures are similar. That's called homology. And homology, by definition now, means that it is similar because of a common ancestor. So common ancestry and homology go in this viciously circular argument. So if homology is defined to mean common descent, then it cannot be used as evidence for common descent. This is question begging. This is circular reasoning. So it's not only failing the test in terms of empirical evidence, an empirical observation is used in a circular argument that fails the test logically and philosophically. Not just scientifically, but this means that the argument is not being used in a valid way. That's claiming to be science, it can't be presented that way because it breaks the laws of logic. It assumes what it seeks to prove. And so it was said by Ernst Mayr in The Growth of Biological Thought, a neo-Darwinist. He says, after 1859, there has been only one definition of homologous that makes biological sense. Attributes of two organisms are homologous when they are derived from an equivalent characteristic. So Ernst Mayr participates in this, accidentally, I'm sure, participates in this logical error, this mistake, this fallacy. After 1859, the definition was changed. Homology, instead of just observing structural similarity, came to mean structural similarity because of common descent, common ancestry. And so what this means is that attributes of two organisms that are homologous are said to be homologous when they are derived from an equivalent characteristic. Falls into the same question begging, circular reasoning. And then says, well, why can't people just see how plain the evidence for, or this particular evidence for evolution is? Well, because it's philosophically and logically invalid. Not to mention it has empirical errors as well. It hasn't been demonstrated empirically in any sense either. There must be evidence for common ancestry before it can be called homologous. So if the definition is going to be that these structures are similar because they have a common ancestor. What we need to prove instead is that there is, in fact, a common ancestor that we can point to empirically and show with the data that this is, in fact, that common ancestor. And through the passing down of these traits to these different creatures that have homologous structures, that is why they have homologous structures. But that hasn't been demonstrated. They also argue that similar structures point to common ancestry. Jonathan Wells points this out in his book, Icons of Evolution. Common ancestry demonstrates homology, which demonstrates common ancestry. It's locked into a circle. So something outside the circle would have to prove it to be valid. Philosopher Ronald Brady in 1985, in his paper on the independence of systematics, talks about this and talks about the importance of philosophy of science. But he says, by making our explanation into the definition of the condition to be explained, we express not scientific hypothesis, but belief. We are so convinced that our explanation is true that we no longer see any need to distinguish it from the situation we were trying to explain. Dogmatic endeavors of this kind must eventually leave the realm of science. So what he points out there in his statement is that when we look at something and observe it empirically in the world, then we want to know why it happens. If we make the definition, if we're trying to, we move from finding why it happens to saying definitionally, it's because of this that this happens, and then we fall into that circular reasoning. He says that this is not science, but this is belief. This is dogmatics. It leaves the realm of science and goes to something else. Another biologist, Tim Barra, tried famously and failed famously to defend this homology. But the problem was the argument itself, the conditions of the statement were not changed. And so he falls into what becomes known as Barra's blunder. Tim Barra wrote a book called Evolution and the Myth of Creationism. And so biologist Tim Barra was defending Darwinian evolution, compared the fossil record to car models. Okay, so, and this is his, on the left here, this is his drawing or his example. He used model cars, car models to describe this. Now listen to what he said in 1990. He said, if you compare a 1953 and a 1954 Corvette side by side, then a 1954 and a 1955 model, and so on, descent with modification is overwhelmingly obvious. This is what paleontologists do with fossils, and the evidence is so solid and comprehensive that it cannot be denied by reasonable people. And it looks like I wrote here people twice. Fix that. So his argument is from cars. Okay, now notice, remember, his book is called Evolution and the Myth of Creationism. Okay, that is that God created the world according to the biblical model. Okay, think about his example. Cars are designed from an archetype. They're designed from plans of a designer. And so he tries to use this as how cars develop over time and the model changes. We can see similarities from them and recognize that going back to an earlier model, they came from a common source. Okay, so one, his example points out a type of creation by design. And he's trying to deny creationism by using an example of it. Now, this isn't biblical creationism. This is human beings drawing out an idea from their head onto a paper or a computer program and creating uh, with given materials something, and then modifying based on adjustments and new discoveries and things like this over time. But a succession of similar forms does not explain mechanism. Just because we see that there are similar things from the Corvette from 1953 to 1963 to 1968 to 1978, and we recognize cars have engines, cars have tires, cars have horns, they have similar things going on with them mechanically and the way they look. That doesn't explain descent with modification. That doesn't explain how. We know how in terms of cars, but we don't know how in terms of fossils. That's the very thing that scientists forwarding this theory would need to prove and demonstrate. The mechanism of how Corvettes are modified can be observed, but in fossils, it cannot be observed. And so to look at homologous structures today and say, okay, well, they're similar, and therefore it must come from some archetype of four, just like cars, it doesn't follow. Darwin recognized this very need. He wrote, one might come to the conclusion that a species had not been independently created, but had descended, like varieties, from other species. Nevertheless, such a conclusion, even if well-founded, would be unsatisfactory until it could be shown how the innumerable species inhabiting this world have been modified. So Darwin recognized himself. It's not just enough to say, observe that structures in different creatures are similar, and assume that they're similar because of a descent of a common ancestor, from a common ancestor or progenitor. There would need to be a demonstration of how that took place, the mechanism of why and how that happened. He goes on to write, it is therefore of the highest importance to gain a clear insight into the means of modification, meaning the means. Well, okay, we observe similar structures in creatures. We observe that they seem to be homologous. Okay, nobody should be debating that. That being said, if we're going to posit that that's because they had an ancestor in common, we need to know the means of how they got from the ancestor in common down to the horse, the man, the bat with these homologous structures. Now, Darwin thought it was through natural selection. Some think it's through the DNA codes or things like this. They develop very differently. The wing of the bat and the arm of the human and the leg of the horse are very different purposes. So recognizing commonality does not observe the mechanism of how and why the structures are similar and homologous. It's not tied to an observable biological process that we know of. It's not demonstrable from the fossil record of this common descent. All we see is that these things look similar, and somebody may say, well, it's from a common ancestor, but that's not necessarily a logical leap unless that can be demonstrated empirically, not just defined in terms of having a common ancestor. There's also scientific problems, not just philosophical ones. Biologists have known for decades that homologous structures are not due to similar genes. It's not because the bat and the human and the horse have similar genes and genetic codes that produce these things. We actually don't know to date, as far as I understand, why these structures are homologous in such different creatures with different genetic codes, different DNA. The mechanism that supposedly produces similar structures remains unknown and unobserved. And so this is something that, if it could be demonstrated, would have to be shown in some empirical way for it to be evidence for a common ancestor. Although you're not told that when this is placed in the textbooks. Students, people reading textbooks, scientists are just presented with this faulty argumentation that this is evidence for evolution. They take an empirical observation and then they use a series of 3 or 4 fallacious, logically erroneous arguments to say it's evidence for evolution. That's inaccurate, and it's actually dishonest, even though people often just make it an error in thinking. One, it's a non sequitur. Similar structures does not necessarily mean that there are common ancestors. It could be empirically demonstrated, theoretically, but that does not necessarily follow. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, so it's a non sequitur. Number 2, the fallacy of renaming and redefining something. So having one definition of homology, observing the common structures, but then defining homology as similar structures by definition from and because of a common ancestor. That's changing, moving from one definition of homology to another and trying to use that as evidence for evolution. It's also question begging and circular reasoning. Because if you define homology that way, that similar structures are similar because of a common ancestor, and therefore they're evidence of a common ancestor, then you have engaged in logical, illogical reasoning that is logically fallacious and mistaken. Wells writes, almost every biology textbook uses vertebrate limbs to illustrate homology and claims homology is evidence for common ancestry. They therefore fall into the same vicious circle that biologists and philosophers have been criticizing for over half a century. So not some conspiracy in my mind. I think it's just, number one, old textbooks, number 2, the logical mistakes that people aren't aware of and aren't thinking critically, and also some unwillingness to abandon these things as evidence of a theory that is cherished. Philosophers and scientists criticize this very often, but it still shows up in biology and other textbooks as evidence for evolution. And so the case is supposed to be that that the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. But when you use these types of arguments to convince people, you're convincing them with something other than the truth, and therefore it does not become knowledge. Knowledge is justified true belief. And so people believing these things, though they may give acquiescence to the theory of evolution, it is neither justified nor true, the reason that they're believing those things. Henry G., chief science writer for Nature, points out, although I think this is more difficult in real life than probably is realized, but he writes, nobody should be afraid to ask a silly question. Statements from authorities in a field should be as subject to scrutiny as those emanating from the most humble sources, even a beginning student. And so Henry G., he's an evolutionist, he's a scientist, but he writes that these things should be questioned, these paradigms should be questioned. The questions are good, but a lot of times these type of things, the fallacious nature of them, the dogmatic beliefs included of them, do not invite questions and don't make an environment of question asking and inquiry really possible, and which makes it harder to change, harder to develop, and harder for science to really follow that what's supposed to be a self-correcting nature. This is why it's important to deal with the level of presuppositions of what are the foundational principles and beliefs that we take with us into our thinking, into our science, into our observations, and we need to be aware of our own thinking and the common mistakes that we can fall into without often even realizing